The morning Josephine first stood in the great hall of Ashford Hall with the deed box open before her, she was not alone. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dorset, stood at her left shoulder, still and watchful as a woman carved from the same old stone. The solicitor's senior partner, Mr. Aldous Crane, had arrived without announcement an hour earlier, his travelling coat still damp from the November roads, and he had brought with him a younger man whose bearing did not match the plainness of his coat. Josephine had seen that bearing before in the 3 weeks past, bent over estate maps in the library, and walking the perimeter of the South Field in a manner too unhurried to be ordinary industry. She had not known what to make of it then. She understood it now because Mr. Crane had just addressed the man by his title, and the great hall had gone entirely quiet, and Lady Cecily was standing 6 feet away with her colour gone and nothing in her expression but the fixed blankness of a woman whose entire architecture of authority had fallen away beneath her feet. That moment was still 3 weeks distant from where the story began. In the autumn of 1833, Ashford Hall in the county of Shropshire stood in a condition best described as carefully held together. 340 acres of farmland, a modest park, a library whose shelves ran to the ceiling, and a set of household accounts that had been managed with quiet precision for 18 months by a woman to whom the Hall's legal standing was, at the time, entirely unclear. Josephine had come to Ashford Hall the year before, following her uncle Edmund Hale's death, at the invitation of his widow. The invitation had been extended in terms that might have sounded like generosity to an outside ear, an unmarried niece of modest means being offered a home and a position within a well-ordered household. But Josephine was a careful reader of language, and she had understood from the first sentence of Lady Cecily's letter that she was being offered employment dressed in the clothes of charity. She had come anyway. She had very few alternatives, and Ashford Hall had been the place she loved best in her childhood, when her uncle Edmund was still alive, and the house had felt like a place where a person could breathe. Edmund had been a mild, bookish man who kept his papers in extraordinary order, and had once spent an entire afternoon explaining to a 12-year-old Josephine the logic of an entail clause in a deed of conveyance, not because she had asked, but because she had been sitting quietly beside him, and he had believed correctly that she was interested. She had been. She had always been interested in the things most people thought unfit for a girl's attention, the accounts and the documents, and the precise language of legal obligation that governed who held what and on what terms. Edmund had encouraged her interest without making a ceremony of it. He had simply answered her questions and then asked her to check his arithmetic, and she had found 2 errors, and he had laughed. She thought of that afternoon often, in the months after his death, when she sat at the household writing desk in the small room off the morning room and entered figures into the ledgers that Lady Cecily reviewed without curiosity and signed without reading. Lady Cecily was not a cruel woman in the way cruelty is usually imagined, with intention and relish. She was a woman whose understanding of the world ran along a set of clear channels. Property was a matter of legal title and social standing, and a woman without adequate title or financial standing was a liability to be managed rather than a person to be consulted. She was efficient in her management of Josephine. She fed her adequately, housed her in the smaller of the 2 guest rooms on the east corridor, and ensured she was presentable at dinner on the occasions when visitors came. She also, in November of 1833, began to speak openly of a particular arrangement she had been pursuing for several months, a match between Josephine and a Mr. Gerald Foss of Worcestershire, a landowner of middle years, twice widowed, who had written twice already and was expected for a visit before Christmas. Lady Cecily had mentioned Mr. Foss to Josephine first in the manner of announcing a pleasant piece of news, then in the manner of confirming a settled plan, and, by November, had progressed to the manner of informing a dependent of the practical steps already taken. Josephine had listened to each version with the same level attention she brought to everything, and had offered on each occasion a quiet and unornamented refusal. She did not wish to marry Mr. Foss. She did not say so with heat. She said it with the plainness of someone stating a fact that ought not to require repetition. Lady Cecily did not hear refusals well. It was in this atmosphere that the land agent arrived. He came on a grey Tuesday morning in the second week of November, carried in a hired carriage from Shrewsbury along with a leather case of instruments and several rolls of drawing paper. His name, according to the letter Lady Cecily received the day before, was Mr. Thomas Ward, land agent, engaged by Messrs. Crane and Brennan, the firm of solicitors managing the Heir estate, to conduct a survey of Ashford Hall's grounds and buildings in preparation for a potential sale. Lady Cecily received this information with the placid satisfaction of a woman whose plan was proceeding on schedule. She told Josephine at breakfast that a surveyor was coming and that he was to be given access to whatever he required. And then she left for a morning call in the village, and the surveyor arrived while the house was quiet. Josephine was in the kitchen garden when the carriage came. She heard the wheels on the gravel drive and came around the side of the house to find the man already standing in the open air, looking up at the facade with the still, calibrating attention of someone calculating something. He was, she observed, perhaps 35, with a coat that was well made and well worn, and hands that looked as though they had handled more than surveying instruments. When he heard her step on the gravel, he turned, and she found herself meeting a pair of grey eyes that were entirely composed. She introduced herself directly, without the social performance that the occasion might have demanded, because she was who she was, and he was apparently an agent engaged to survey a house in which she kept the accounts, and there was no sensible reason to pretend otherwise. "Miss Hale," she said, "I keep the household records. If you require access to any part of the estate, I can tell you where things are and which doors are kept locked." He regarded her for a moment with an expression that was neither surprise nor indifference. "Thomas Ward," he said. "That would be a considerable assistance, Miss Hale. I had not expected to find someone who knew the property in detail." She said she had managed the Hall for 18 months and knew the 340 acres reasonably well, and asked whether he wished to begin with the house or the grounds. He said the grounds, and she showed him the way to the east field, because the path was not well marked and the gate latch was stiff. She was not performing a courtesy. She simply knew where the gate latch was, and he did not, and leaving him to find it on his own would have wasted the better part of his morning. She thought no more of it until the following day, when she went into the library for the estate ledgers from 1829, and found him there standing at the long table with an old map unrolled before him, and weighted at the corners with whatever objects had been to hand. A candlestick, a paperweight that had been her uncle's, a volume of Blackstone's commentaries, and a jar of dried lavender that had sat on the table so long it was part of the furniture. He apologized for using the room and offered to leave. She told him the library was the most useful room in the house for work of that kind, and that he was welcome to remain. She collected her ledgers and sat at the opposite end of the table and entered her figures. And for an hour neither of them spoke, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was, in fact, the most comfortable hour Josephine had spent in some months. She noticed in that hour that he read quickly and that he did not make unnecessary marks on the map. She noticed that when he referred to the Blackstone volume, he replaced it in its exact position afterward. She noticed that he was entirely uninterested in the kind of conversation people used to fill the air with, and that this interested her more than she thought it should. Over the following week, Their paths crossed on the estate grounds twice each day with a regularity that was explained by the fact that he was surveying 340 acres, and she was managing their upkeep, and the same fences needed mending, and the same drainage ditch needed attention, regardless of who was observing them. She brought him the acreage figures from the 1821 survey so he could compare them against his own measurements. He said the south field boundary had shifted and showed her the discrepancy in the drawing, and she saw immediately what he meant and confirmed it against the ledger entry for the field's lease income, which was correct for the lesser acreage. He looked at her a beat longer than the observation required. "You read surveys," he said. "I read whatever is placed before me," she said. He said nothing after that, but something in the set of his expression shifted in a way she could not precisely name. The library became their habitual shared space in the evenings after dinner, when Lady Cecily withdrew to the sitting room, and Josephine was not required to perform company. He would come in after his own supper at the coaching inn in the village where he lodged, and would work at his end of the table, and she would work at hers, and they would occasionally speak, not about themselves, but about the documents before them, which was as close to speaking about themselves as either of them was accustomed to manage. On the fourth evening it rained very heavily, and she had been out inspecting a roof tile that had come loose in the eastern wing, and she came back into the corridor near the library door with her shawl wet through and her hair loose at one side. She did not see him until she was nearly past the doorway, and he was standing inside with his coat already off his shoulders, having apparently just returned from the south field in the same downpour. He held the coat without embarrassment. She looked at the state of them both, and he looked at the state of them both, and for a moment the comedy of two people who had each tried to be sensible about the weather and had each failed was simply present in the room between them. "The tile," she said. "The south boundary marker," he said. She found she was nearly smiling, and she turned away before she was quite. She did not know, as she moved down the corridor with her wet shawl folded over her arm, that he stood in the library doorway a moment longer than was necessary, and watched her go with an expression that said rather more than anything he had put into words. She could not have known. She was not looking. Lady Cecily, meanwhile, had been looking very carefully at the surveyor, but at different things. She had noted the quality of his instruments, the discretion of his manner, and the fact that the firm of Crane and Brennan was among the most reputable in Shropshire, and she had concluded that the sale of the hall was proceeding with all appropriate efficiency. She had written to Mr. Foss in the second week of November to suggest a date in December for his visit. She had informed Josephine of this at the breakfast table, with the manner of a woman announcing a concluded negotiation. Josephine said she had already told Lady Cecily she did not wish to marry Mr. Foss. Lady Cecily said that what Josephine wished was a matter of declining relevance to the practical situation, and that a woman in Josephine's position ought to be grateful for a settled prospect, and that by December the question of the hall itself would be concluded, and Josephine's residency there would consequently have a natural terminus. She said it the way she said most things, without particular heat, as a statement of conditions she considered fixed. Josephine returned to the household accounts after breakfast and entered 3 columns of figures, and found that she had made an error in the second column and had to start it again, which she did not usually do. She noticed this and recognized what it meant, and set the pen down for a moment and looked at the wall. She had known in some general and unexamined way that the hall's status was uncertain, and that Lady Cecily was managing that uncertainty according to her own interests. She had not known that a date had been attached to her removal. The date made it solid in a way the general uncertainty had not been. She picked the pen up and finished the column correctly. It was 3 days later that she heard the conversation through the closed morning room door She had come down the east corridor at 10:30 to return the household accounts book to the small room off the morning room, a task she performed so regularly that she did not think to announce herself. The morning room door was not quite latched, and Lady Cecily's voice was distinct and clear. And so was the voice of the man with her, which Josephine recognized after a moment as Mr. Silas Brennan, the solicitor's clerk who had visited twice in the previous 6 months to discuss the estate administration. Lady Cecily was saying that she wanted the matter of the deed concluded before Mr. Crane could be induced to examine the original document. Brennan said the original deed box had been in the housekeeper's keeping and that he had not yet had occasion to review the full text of the conveyance. Lady Cecily said that she trusted he would ensure it was not necessary for anyone else to review it either, and that she would be most grateful for his continued discretion regarding any provisions in the original document that might complicate an otherwise straightforward administration. Brennan said he understood completely and that the question of the entail had always been, in his view, a matter of interpretation, and that the interpretation most favourable to the current administration would naturally be the one placed before the courts if the question arose. Lady Cecily said she did not want the question to arise, and that she expected the sale to be concluded before Christmas and the hall's occupancy to be settled on new terms, meaning on Cecily's terms, or on no one's terms at all. There was a small silence, and then Brennan said that Miss Hale's removal from the property might simplify certain aspects of the process, since a resident claimant, even an uninformed one, complicated the presentation of title. Lady Cecily said she was attending to that through Mr. Foss. Josephine stood in the corridor with the accounts book pressed against her chest and her left hand flat against the cold plaster of the wall, and she understood every word she had just heard with the same unhurried clarity with which she understood ledger columns and survey maps. They were going to sell the hall without showing her the deed. They were going to remove her before anyone examined the original document. Brennan knew there was something in the entail, something in the language of the original conveyance, that complicated Lady Cecily's claim to dispose of the property as she chose, and he was choosing not to see it. She did not move until she heard the chairs shift inside the room. She returned to the east corridor and stood at the window at its end and looked out at the park for 30 seconds, counting the bare trees along the south walk, reaching 7 before she felt her breathing had returned to its ordinary pace. She had 2 things she needed: the deed box and someone who could tell her whether her reading of page 17 was correct. She went to find Mrs. Dorset. The housekeeper had been at Ashford Hall for 22 years. She had served Edmund Hale with a loyalty that was not performed, but architectural, part of the structure of the house itself, and she had received Josephine's arrival the previous year. Not as a stranger, but as a person the house had been expecting. When Josephine came to the kitchen and asked quietly whether Mrs. Dorset still held the deed box that Edmund had left in her keeping, the housekeeper set down the linen she was folding and looked at her for a long moment. "He told me, Mrs." Dorset said, "to give it only to the person who knew what to look for on page 17. Josephine said, quietly, "Page 17. Mrs. Dorset nodded once and went to the back of the larder, where she had concealed the deed box inside a larger trunk of household plate, and she brought it out and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Josephine took the box to the library. It was nearly 9 o'clock, and the house was quiet, and the fire in the library had been banked low but not out. She lit 2 additional candles and set them at either side of the deed box, and opened it, and found the document inside exactly as her uncle would have filed it, chronologically ordered, clearly labelled in his careful hand. Page 17 was part of the original conveyance of Ashford Hall, dated 1791, with an addendum in her uncle's hand from 1822 in the margin, and a separate filed memorandum of legal interpretation dated 1826. Also Edmund's, citing a remainder clause in the original entail. The language of the clause was dense and had been drafted in the manner of the period, but Josephine read it twice and then read it again, following each relative clause to its referent, and she arrived at a conclusion that was, for all its legal dressing, very clear. The entail on Ashford Hall had been drawn as a fee-tail special with a remainder to the heirs of the body of the second son of the original grantee, with a further remainder appended in 1791 to any blood-descended niece or nephew of that line in the event of the failure of male heirs. Edmund had been the last male heir. His wife was not a blood relation of the line. The Hall passed, under the original entail, to the named remainder, and the named remainder in a filed memorandum Edmund had attached himself to page 17 was Josephine, being the only blood-descended niece of the line. She set the document down and looked at the candlelight on the table for a moment. Her name was on the deed. It had been there since 1791. She had not known how to look for it, and she had not known she should. She heard the library door and turned, and Thomas was in the doorway with his coat on, having apparently come late from the inn, still holding the roll of drawings he had been working on. He stopped when he saw her face, and then he saw the deed box, and then he looked at the document open on the table before her, and she watched something move across his expression that he did not entirely suppress. "Mr. Ward," she said. He came into the room and set his drawings down and stood opposite her and looked at the open page without touching it. She said, "The remainder clause names me. I have been managing an estate that belongs to me, and I did not know it." He said nothing for a moment, and in that silence she felt the strange quality of his quietness, which had never been the quietness of a man without opinion. "Is my reading correct?" she asked. "The entail clause on page 17. Am I reading the remainder correctly?" He looked at the document again, and then he looked at her, and he said very carefully, "Your reading is correct." She asked how he knew, and he said that he had studied property law at some length, and had encountered similar instruments. She held his gaze and understood, in a way she could not have articulated, that there was something in his answer that was entirely true and not entirely sufficient. He did not fill the silence. She did not press it. She asked him instead whether the entail clause would hold against Lady Cecily's claim to sell. He said it would hold if it were read by the correct person before the sale was concluded. She looked at the document and then at the fire, and said she intended to ensure that it was. He stood at the opposite end of the table, and they looked at each other across the open deed, and the candles made the room very small, and the night outside very large, and she was aware of his hands resting on the table edge, steady and still, and of her own hands, which were also steady, which surprised her a little. He said, quietly, "You have been managing 340 acres for 18 months on the assumption that you were a guest in another woman's house." She said yes. He said, "That will not be the case after tomorrow." She looked at him a moment and then nodded once, and he picked up his drawings and said good night, and she stayed in the library with the deed box until the candles burned to their last inch. The solicitor's senior partner, Mr. Aldous Crane, arrived the following morning at 10 o'clock in a travelling carriage bearing the firm's seal. He had not been sent for by Lady Cecily. He had in fact written ahead to announce himself, but his letter had arrived only that morning as he did, which was the result of his having sent the letter and himself by the same morning's post, which was the result of a private communication he had received the evening before from a party he declined to name in the letter, but whose direction of his attention to Ashford Hall he trusted absolutely. Lady Cecily received him in the morning room with a smoothness that cost her something, and Brennan, who had been at the hall since 9 o'clock, stood at the writing desk with an expression that did not quite manage composure. Mr. Crane was a man of 60, precise in his manner and entirely immune to the social weather of a room, and he said, when he had accepted a chair and a cup of tea and declined to drink it, that he wished to review the original deed of conveyance for Ashford Hall before any further steps towards sale were concluded. Lady Cecily said she was certain that was unnecessary and that Mr. Brennan had the matter well in hand. Mr. Crane said that it was entirely necessary and that he had reason to believe the matter had not been in any hand that suited him, and that he preferred to form his own view of the document. Brennan said the deed box was in the housekeeper's keeping and might take some time to retrieve. Mrs. Dorset was already standing in the doorway of the morning room with the deed box in her hands, because Josephine had asked her to be there at 10 o'clock, and she had learned in 22 years that Josephine's predecessors had never once been wrong about a time. The household had gathered by this point in the way that households do when something is turning. The parlour-maid was in the doorway of the hall. The coachman had come in from the stable-yard on some pretext and had not left. Mr. Gerald Foss, who had arrived the previous afternoon for his prospective visit, and had been given the blue guest room, and a dinner at which Josephine had been entirely civil and entirely firm, stood near the window of the morning room with the glazed expression of a man who had arrived for one story and found himself inside a different one entirely. Thomas Ward was in the great hall. He had come with Mr. Crane, which Josephine had not known until that moment, and he stood in the hall with his coat on and his leather case in his hand, and a composure that was, she now understood, the composure of a man entirely accustomed to standing in rooms that went quiet when his rank became known. Mr. Crane opened the deed box and turned to page 17 without hesitation, as a man who had known what page to turn to. He read the entail clause aloud. He read the remainder clause. He read Edmund's memorandum of 1826. He read the filed interpretation, which cited 2 cases in equity and the original terms of the 1791 conveyance. He read Josephine's name. The morning room was very still. Lady Cecily said into the stillness that she could not believe a document of such antiquity could be held to govern the present disposition of the estate, and that Mr. Brennan had assured her the clause was a matter of interpretation. Mr. Crane said that the clause was not, in his view, a matter of interpretation, and that Mr. Brennan's view of the matter appeared to have been formed in conditions he found professionally troubling. Brennan said nothing. His colour was not good. Lady Cecily said that this was all very irregular, and that she had been managing the hall in good faith for the better part of 2 years, and that Josephine had never indicated any claim to the property. Josephine said, from where she was standing near the door, that she had not known of the claim until the previous evening. Lady Cecily turned to look at her. The turning was slow. Josephine said that she understood the inconvenience, and that she wished Lady Cecily to be comfortably accommodated in whatever arrangements followed, which was a true statement and not a performed one. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Mr. Crane said he would wish to speak with Miss Hale privately regarding the formal steps required to establish her title, and that, in his view, those steps were straightforward and could be completed within a fortnight, and that in the meantime no sale of the property could proceed. Then he turned toward Thomas, who was standing in the doorway between the morning room and the great hall, and he said, "I believe you have formed a view of the estate's condition, Lord Ashford." Lady Cecily's hand went still on the arm of her chair. Mr. Foss looked from the doorway to Thomas and back again with the expression of a man revising a significant number of his earlier calculations. Thomas said yes, he had formed a view, and that the hall was in considerably better condition than the circumstances of its administration had suggested it might be, and that the accounts were among the most accurate he had encountered in a property of this kind, and that he attributed this to the care of the person who had been keeping them. He looked at Josephine as he said it, not at Lady Cecily, not at the room, at Josephine. She stood inside that gaze for a moment. She felt the weight of the previous 18 months settle and shift, not lifting exactly, but redistributing into something she could carry differently. Lady Cecily said, in a voice from which all social smoothness had departed, that she did not understand why a baronet's heir had represented himself as a common land agent. Thomas said quietly that he had represented himself as a land agent because he had wished to understand the property and its management on its own terms, without the social performance that attended his name. He said that he had found the understanding he came for. He said nothing further. Lady Cecily looked at Josephine for a long moment. Then she looked away, at the window, at the November garden, at the bare oaks along the South Walk, which were 300 years old, and did not change their nature based on who was watching. The room began to come undone slowly, the way rooms do after the thing that was holding them together has resolved. Mr. Crane spoke quietly to Josephine about the practical steps ahead. Mrs. Dorset withdrew with the deed box, holding it with both hands, the way one carries something returned to its rightful place. Mr. Foss made a brief excuse about his carriage, and was last seen walking toward the stable yard with the briskness of a man remembering an engagement he had forgotten entirely. Brennan was still at the writing desk. He did not speak again. Lady Cecily remained in the morning room for some time after the others had gone, and when she came out she went to her rooms upstairs without addressing anyone. She was not a wicked woman. She was a woman whose entire framework for understanding what was reasonable and what was not had been built on a particular reading of the world, and that reading had just been corrected in front of every person whose opinion she had ever managed, and that was its own kind of consequence. Josephine did not gloat. There was nothing in her to gloat with. She went through the rest of that morning doing the things that needed doing, because they still needed doing, regardless of the day's shape. She spoke with Mr. Crane for an hour in the library about the entail and the steps to formal title, and the legal position of the existing household staff, which she wanted protected, and she made notes in her careful hand on a fresh sheet of paper, and she filed the sheet with the deed box. In the early afternoon, when the carriage had come to take Mr. Crane to his next engagement, and the house had settled into the particular quiet of a place that has just been through something, Josephine put on her coat and went outside. The park in late November was bare and grey and entirely itself. The South Walk was wet with the morning's rain, and the gravel crunched under her boots in the way she had known since she was 12 years old, and visiting her uncle and following his long stride down this same path, while he explained land tenure to her over her head, and she listened to every word. She walked to the end of the South Walk where the iron gate opened onto the field path, the same gate whose latch was stiff, and she put her hand on it. She heard steps behind her on the gravel and did not turn immediately. Thomas stopped a few feet away. He was not wearing his surveying coat. He looked, for the first time since he had arrived at the hall, like himself, whatever that meant. She was still learning what it meant. She said, "You knew. When I showed you the deed last night, you knew the clause would hold." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you came here knowing there was a question about the entail." He said that Mr. Crane had found reason to examine the document and had wanted an independent assessment of the property's physical condition, which was an honest description of the commission. She turned to look at him. The light was flat and cold, the kind of November light that shows things clearly without flattering them, and she looked at him steadily in that light, and she said, "You could have told me what you were." He said, "Yes, I could have." There was a pause in which the wind moved through the oak branches overhead, and a rook called somewhere to the south. He said, "You were already treating the matter correctly. I did not want to become a variable in your calculation." She considered this. It was, she thought, a version of a reason that held together, if you accepted its premises, which she was not quite ready to confirm. She turned back to the gate and lifted the latch, the same stiff iron resistance as always, and pushed it open and held it. He walked through. She followed, and the gate swung shut behind her, and the 340 acres lay before them in the November afternoon, bearing the same dry grass and the same patient hedgerows they had always borne. And the hall stood at their backs in the grey Shropshire light, its old stone holding the heat of the morning fire somewhere inside it, its library full of documents she had read and documents she had yet to read, its threshold belonging now, in every line of law and every line of fact, to the woman who had been managing it all along. The latch on the gate did not catch properly on the return swing, which it never did, and Josephine reached back without looking and pressed it closed with the flat of her hand, a gesture so familiar her arm moved before she thought it, and the iron seated with its small, reliable sound, and the field path stretched ahead of them, and neither of them was in any hurry.